Hello, everybody. I'm Logan Crawford, and this is the award-winning TV talk show right here on Ebru Fresh Outlook. By the time the New York primary usually rolls around, it's often nothing more than a victory lap for the soon-to-be crowned nominees of each party. But not this year. Hillary Clinton is looking to get some steam back into her campaign's engine with a win of her adopted home state, and Donald Trump wants to scoop up every possible delegate as the primary season becomes a numbers game. Let's say hello to our panel of experts. I am joined by Alain Sanders, political science professor at St. Peter's University, John Boyd, principal of the Boyd Company Incorporated, and joining us live via Skype is Dr. Bart Rossi, political psychologist. And Bart, you are up in the monitor. I will begin with you. Watching the debate the other night between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, I was seeing a lot of Trump in Sanders. They're both angry. They both have similar stances on NATO, similar stances on Israel. It's kind of interesting how left meets right here, huh?
Well, you use the anger word, and the anger factor is big in this election cycle. And I think Bernie has brought in a lot of folks who are angry, and he has basically won this primary. I mean, Trump perhaps has dominated, but in my view, Bernie has won it, even though he probably won't be the nominee. I mean, he's got all of those folks who are angry about wealth only going to the wealthy. Wealthy can only afford education. How come all the tax breaks are only for the wealthy? So yes, I think that Bernie and Trump have some similarities, but it's quite dynamic in terms of the debate the other night. And I kind of thought that's the way a debate should be. It was a little ugly at times, but I think people should duke it out and talk about the issues and stand up for themselves. I think Hillary did a pretty good job of defending herself and where she is, and Bernie presented himself. So I thought it was quite dynamic.
John, the painful lesson for a lot of the electorate this election season is the fact that this democratic process is not very democratic. Bernie Sanders keeps on winning state after state after state, 7 out of the last 8 primaries and or caucuses, and yet he is behind. The superdelegates make it unfair on the Republican side and on the Democrat side, and on the Republican side, you see people like Ted Cruz winning voterless caucuses. What do you think?
Clearly, Trump lacks the type of organization, the ground game that Ted Cruz has. What's interesting to me is watching Trump now use his media skills, his national media skills, to sort of brand any effort to take the nomination away from him as not legitimate. I mean, Trump's right-hand man, Roger Stone, has called it the steal. I mean, so there's now an effort to delegitimize any effort to deny Trump the nomination, even if he gets close to 1237. And we'll see. I mean, the media is picking up on this idea that, you know, Cruz is deploying some undemocratic tactics in his efforts to secure delegates.
Do you think it's going to blow up in everybody's face?
No, I don't think it's going to blow up in everybody's face, and I don't think it's undemocratic, because what many people forget, this is not the general election. The general election is the democratic exercise. This is the selection of a nominee. And nominees can be selected in many ways, and one of the ways they can be selected is in part by popular appeal, and in part by what the establishment of the party wants the candidate to be. Never forget that many of these primaries are open primaries, where independents and members of the other party can actually show up and vote for the nominee of your party. So there's nothing wrong in having superdelegates, establishment people, party officials, government officials being part of the process. If you cut them out, as the Democrats did back in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s, they revolted. They said, we are the members of the party, we are the elected officials, why do we not have some say in who the nominee is? So I don't think it's undemocratic. I think it's quite right to have a popular component to it, but it's also quite right to have an establishment or government official component to it. And for Mr. Trump's complaint, he's really a whining bully. I mean, he knew what the process was, and if he didn't, why was he running for president?
Let's get Bart in on the conversation. I want you to look into that crystal ball, Bart, and tell us what's going to happen on Tuesday in New York as New York State goes to vote. Apparently, Trump's children, for example, can't even vote in this primary because you had to be registered for it about a year ago.
Well, I like giving predictions when I think I'm absolutely going to be right. And on this one, I think that Trump is going to get his momentum back. I think he's gaining it back already. He's going to win big in New York. He's going to win in New Jersey, probably Pennsylvania and California. and he's going to have the psychology in his favor. And I disagree with Alan. I think that when rules are wrong and rules are fuzzy and can be manipulated, people don't like it. Americans don't like being cheated. And as much as I've criticized Trump, I think he's 100% right. This is a cheat. It is a steal. If he wins most of the votes, most of the delegates, most of the states, and he goes to a convention and he's undermined by somebody else who has much less, something's wrong with the rules, and I think most Americans would agree with me. It's a cheat.
I agree with you as well, Bart. John, I'm going to get you in on the conversation. Bernie Sanders couldn't have more different politics from me in the world. We see opposite on every issue, but I find him extremely likable, extremely compelling, extremely interesting, extremely forthright, and extremely honest. He really is a unique politician. The fact that his wife does his tax returns, I love that.
Yes. Well, he is clearly the breakout star of this election cycle. There is a certain authenticity about him that Hillary lacks, I think, to many Democratic voters. It's interesting to me how far he's pushed Hillary to the left. And you know, this idea that being a centrist Democrat is now taboo in the Democratic primary. I mean, they're running away from Bill Clinton's legacy on with issues not beyond trade, but also the crime bill and sound tax and spend policies. I mean, Clinton balanced the budget. That's something that I think a lot of people in the center in a general election will want to have a discussion about. It'll be very difficult now for the Democrats to kind of pivot back to the center after kind of rebuking that moderate legacy of Bill Clinton.
This genuine aspect of Bernie Sanders, I think, really hurts Hillary Clinton because as genuine as he seems, she seems disingenuous. She gets up there and says, I was part of the fight for 15 right from the start. And then she says, by pushing for a $12 an hour minimum wage. Well, which is it? Be honest. Say you think $15 an hour is too high and I'm going to push for 12. But don't say you're for 15 and then you're for 12, and she starts sounding like John Kerry being for it before she was against it.
Sure, that is one of her Achilles heel, that she seems to shift positions. But I would suggest to you that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump have a larger Achilles heel. That is, when you take absolutist positions, it's much harder to pivot back. Bernie Sanders got tripped up by the Daily News when he was asked for the details of his proposals for breaking up banks. It's very nice to have slogans, and both of these candidates have been running on slogans. You know, sock the wealthy, break up the banks, build a wall, ban Muslims from entering the USA. Those are great slogans, presumably because they work, but they don't tell you very much about how you do the real governance. Hillary Clinton is a much more subtle politician. Now, there may be some disingenuousness there, but she's basically a politician that understands that governance is not campaigning. Campaigning is taking absolutist position. Governance is about compromise. And so if you care about compromise, if you believe that you should be working to achieve things, that's the kind of voter, that's the kind of campaign she's conducting. Now, does that get you headlines? Does that get you people cheering? Not necessarily, because governance is not about cheering. Governance is about compromise. So there's the difference.
It's interesting, somebody called the debate a debate between Sanders and Panders the other day, and I think that might stick. Let's get Bart in on the conversation. Bart, Bernie Sanders, a senator from Vermont, went to the Vatican. He looked at it and said, this place is too big. We need to break it up. We should have thousands of families living in here. What do you think of the Pope calling upon Bernie to come visit and talk about the challenges that the world faces, such as climate change?
Well, I'm not sure that Bernie made any hay with this. I don't know why he did it. I don't think it really helps him in the long run. I think he's going to try to identify himself with the Pope, who was quite progressive in his own right. Maybe that sounds good, maybe it makes some sense, but Bernie, I don't think is going anywhere with that effort. I think Bernie has made one big mistake in his campaign. He used the word socialist. He should have consulted with me. I would have told him he should have identified himself as an independent progressive or a progressive independent, but people are labeling him as a socialist or a communist, and I think he's made some mistakes. Bernie appeals to your heart and your soul because I think you're right. He is authentic and he's real. But Hillary appeals to your mind and your sensibility. And in that regard, she's going to win the nomination and she will go on to win the general election, especially if it's Trump or, God forbid, Cruz.
You know, it's interesting, John, that Bart brings up Cruz at the end of his statement there. If you look at Trump and you look at Cruz, the more radical of the two is absolutely Cruz. Trump is talking about negotiating with the Palestinians to get a truce with Israel. He's talking about breaking off of NATO a little bit and restructuring. He's always open to compromise and making deals. Cruz is a guy who reads green eggs and ham on the Senate floor and stalls and mucks up the entire process, correct?
I agree. You know, Trump also doesn't want to touch Social Security, which I think is interesting. Has a lot of support among unions. I think he's, and we've talked about this before, underestimated from the start. You know, but business leaders I talk to around the nation overwhelmingly think Trump would be the strongest GOP candidate in a general election. Americans have a very short attention span. Trump can quickly pivot to the center in a general election, and he can frame the narrative in a way to just expose what Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton's policies it would mean for the economy. You know, Bernie Sanders talks about breaking up the banks. 700,000 Americans work in our nation's financial services industry. And the industry is already under assault by new regulations and taxes. Companies like Morgan Stanley and State Street are sending jobs to low-cost alternatives like Montreal. So there's a real pushback against some of these policies that I think Trump can very effectively make in the general election.
And Trump often does bring up an issue where he's laughed at and ridiculed, and then a few days or even a few weeks later, people are like, you know what, he actually does have a point that NATO is set up for a post-Cold War United States and not for a terrorism-oriented defensive stance that the United States has now. So he comes out with statements that seem outlandish, but if you look a little more closely, sometimes they're nuanced, like you said, that Hillary has.
Right. Well, look, any joke can be outlandish, but it has an element of truth in it. The question is he focusing on the element of truth, or is he focusing on the joke? And that's the problem with Donald Trump. Much of his statements are outrageous.
Well, negotiating peace between Israel and Palestine, treating the Palestinians, at least giving them an appearance of being fair, was ridiculed. And he's right. If you're going to have a deal struck between Israel and Palestine, you're going to have to at least give the appearance of being fair.
But that has been the policy of the United States since time immemorial.
But he's been ridiculed by it.
The United States has always treated both the Israelis and the Palestinians with great respect. So to say that the Palestinians have not been treated with great respect at the negotiating table is nonsense. They've been treated with greater respect than their actual power would call for. So I think he says things, but he doesn't quite understand the underlying elements, though there is an element of truth to what I say. Treat them with respect. Everybody's been treating them with respect. The world community has been treating them with respect. Hillary has been treating them with respect. Bernie has been treating them with respect. The problem with Trump is that the outrageous element outpace the reasonableness that may be underneath, and the solutions that he proposed are not really in conformity with the underlying truths.
All right, let's talk about what got Trump into a lot of trouble about 10 days ago with Dr. Rossi, his abortion statement. It was a hypothetical statement, conversation that he was having with Chris Matthews, and they said if abortion were to be outlawed, then the woman would be punished. Why is that so outrageous to say? If you're breaking the law, don't you get punished?
Well, I saw that while it was happening, and I think it showed that, once again, Trump is not prepared, really, and he really was trying to speak off the cuff. He tries to do things extemporaneously, and sometimes he says things that are wrong. I mean, even people that are for life don't want to blame the woman. You don't blame the woman who's in a jam, who's suffering. He just made a mistake. People make mistakes in an election, by the way. I think he's made many mistakes, but it doesn't seem to matter to his followers what he says. They want a boss. They want someone who's an authoritarian. He's going to get past this. He's going to get past this abortion comment. The momentum's going to be on his side after Tuesday, and he's going to be, I think, the favorite. And I think Cruz is going to have a real tough time undermining him and cheating him. I think it's going to be very tough, because the Donald is very good at media manipulation.
Why won't John Kasich go away, John?
You know, I think he is hoping for this scenario to play out where the party looks to him in a brokered convention. I think he also enjoys running for president. I mean, at a human level, it must be a lot of fun,
right,
to do this. He's still raising money. He just picked up the support of George Pataki. He's actually going to poll better than Ted Cruz, I think, in
New York because he's more of a moderate, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But at a very basic level, I think he enjoys it. It's good for his brand. He's thinking about his second act when his second term is up as governor of Ohio. So he's only helping himself in some ways.
Do you envision him being a vice presidential candidate for the eventual nominee of the Republican Party?
I don't think so, because I think I agree with John that he's building up his brand, and being a vice president doesn't always do that for you. There's great danger because you become associated with the policies of the boss, the president, and that may not work out for you when you're ready to run for election. So I think I agree with you. He's building up his brand. Of course, there's a large ego component to running for president, and once you have that ego and you want to run, you don't want to give it up that easily. So I think there's both the ego component and there's the fact that as long as I'm in the public eye, as long as my brand is out there, as long as I can speak, I can assure perhaps another political future for me, perhaps in the Senate, or you know, he's thinking that way.
All right. Alain, John, and Bart, thank you so much for your time. When we come back on Fresh Outlook, from earthquakes to oil spills, a checkup of our environment.